Long before railroads split the plains and before borders pretended to tame the land, the heart of North America belonged to a people who moved faster than rumors and struck harder than storms. To the Spanish, they were Los Diablos. To Mexican settlers, they were nightmares given flesh. To American frontier families, their name alone could empty a town overnight. They were the Comanche, and for nearly 2 centuries, they ruled the southern plains with a dominance unmatched by any native nation in history. The Comanche did not begin as masters of war on horseback. Their ancestors were Shoshone hunters who once moved on foot through the Rocky Mountain fringes. But history changed the moment the horse escaped from Spanish colonies entered the plains like a living weapon. The Comanche didn't just learn to ride, they re-engineered warfare itself. By the early 1700s, Comanche children rode before they could properly walk. Boys learned to fire arrows from beneath a horse's neck, using the animal's body as a living shield. Warriors could lean sideways at full gallop, nearly invisible to gunfire, then rise to loose arrows with lethal accuracy. This wasn't chaos. It was systemized terror. The Comanche created what historians later called Kamancharia, massive, loosely governed empire stretching across modern Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, New Mexico, and northern Mexico. No European power ever truly controlled this land. Spain tried. Mexico failed. The United States bled for it. Comanche war parties moved with intelligence networks that rivaled modern scouting units. They knew troop movements before soldiers. They struck where defenses were weakest and vanished before retaliation could form. What made them truly terrifying was not just violence, it was psychological warfare. A Comanche raid rarely announced itself. There were no battle lines, no warnings. A settlement could wake to silence, and then screaming. Warriors attacked from multiple directions, often at dawn, when fear was strongest and resistance weakest. They targeted horses first, because a man without a horse on the plains was already dead. Then came weapons, then captives, captivity under. The Comanche was a fate settlers feared more than death. Some captives were ransomed. Others were adopted, fully absorbed into Comanche families, stripped of their old identity and reborn into a warrior culture. Many never wanted to return. This, more than killing, terrified colonial governments. The Comanche didn't just defeat enemies, they converted them. Spanish records describe entire regions of northern Mexico emptied by Comanche raids, villages burned, trade routes collapsed. Governors begged for peace treaties that the Comanche ignored when convenient. The Comanche did not see treaties as permanent, they saw them as tools. Peace today, war tomorrow, depending on advantage. American soldiers, armed with rifles and artillery, quickly learned that technology meant little against speed, terrain, mastery, and strategic patience. One U.S. officer wrote that fighting Comanche cavalry felt like attempting to grasp smoke with bare hands. Battles rarely ended in decisive victory. Even when soldiers won, the Comanche simply withdrew, waited, and returned stronger. But the true source of Comanche terror was cultural, not just military. They believed dominance was survival. Mercy invited weakness. Strength was law. Children were raised on stories of raids and courage. Elders measured a man not by age, but by how many enemies feared his name. This worldview was not born of savagery, it was born at the plains, a land where hesitation meant extinction. By the mid-1800s, disease, starvation, and relentless military pressure finally weakened Comanche power. But even in decline, they never surrendered quietly. Their fall was not a collapse, it was a slow, violent resistance against a world that refused to let them exist as they were. And when Comanche finally broke, it did not break with silence. It broke with echoes of hooves, war cries, and a terror so deep the frontier folklore still whispers their name. If the Comanche ruled the plains like a storm, the Apache ruled the land like a curse silent, patient, and unavoidable. To fight the Apache was not to face an army. It was to face the land itself, turning hostile. Soldiers never feared Apache numbers. They feared their absence. Because when the Apache were not visible, that was when they were closest. The name Apache did not belong to a single tribe. It was a collective label applied to several closely related peoples: Chiricahua, Mescalero, Jicarilla, Western Apache, and others who occupied the most unforgiving terrain in North America. Mountains sharp as knives, deserts where water vanished. Like a lie, canyons that swallowed sound. This land did not weaken them, it perfected them. Apache warfare was built on one principle: never fight fair. They did not march. They did not mass. They did not announce. Apache warriors moved in small groups, sometimes no more than 5 or 6 men, slipping through terrain that outsiders considered impassable. They memorized every ridge, every dry creek bed, every place a man could disappear. Trails were erased. Campfires left no smoke. Footprints vanished beneath deliberate counter-tracking. Us and Mexican soldiers often reported the same terrifying pattern. Days of nothing, then sudden death. A lone sentry would collapse without a sound. A supply wagon would vanish between 2 hills. A patrol would be reduced to blood and silence before a single shot was heard. Survivors spoke of arrows appearing from the earth itself, of gunfire erupting from empty rock faces, of screams echoing after attackers were already gone. Apache warriors understood psychological destruction better than any army of their time. They attacked at moments of weakness, during storms, at night, when men slept, when horses were loose. They struck supply lines instead of forts, knowing hunger and thirst killed slower but more surely than bullets. Soldiers found their canteens emptied, mules gone, ammunition stolen, sometimes without a single confrontation. This was not random violence. It was strategic erosion. The Apache believed that survival required absolute awareness. Children were trained early to endure pain, hunger, and exhaustion. Running long distances without water was common. Tracking was not a skill, it was identity. An Apache scout could read a footprint like a sentence, tell how many men passed, how tired they were, whether they carried fear or confidence. Their leaders were not kings, but war chiefs, chosen by reputation and proven skill. Authority came from success. Failure meant replacement. This system created warriors who were adaptable, ruthless, and intensely loyal to abstract power. But to survival and kin, figures like Geronimo, Cochise, and Victorio became legends. Not because of large victories, but because they refused to be erased. Geronimo, with fewer than 50 followers at times, evaded thousands of US and Mexican troops for years. He crossed borders at will, exploiting the slowness and bureaucracy of his enemies. Each escape humiliated governments. Each reappearance reminded settlers that conquest was not complete. What terrified authorities most was that the Apache could not be forced into decisive defeat. There was no capital to capture, no army to annihilate. Every loss was temporary, every victory incomplete. Even when Apache bands were cornered, they fought like animals, backed into fire, explosive, precise, and deadly. Settlers told stories meant to scare children into obedience, stories of Apache eyes watching from cliffs, of shadows moving against moonlight. Soldiers slept in boots, rifles loaded, nerves frayed. Desert posts recorded higher suicide rates than battlefield deaths. The Apache didn't just kill bodies, they wore down minds. Yet beneath the fearsome reputation lay a harsh truth history rarely emphasizes. The Apache fought because they were being hunted. Their lands were invaded, their water sources seized, their families targeted. Each raid was retaliation layered upon retaliation. Each ambush was memory made violent. When the Apache were finally defeated, it was not by superior tactics, but by starvation, relentless pursuit, broken treaties, and forced imprisonment. Even then, surrender was bitter and reluctant. Geronimo wept when he gave up, not from fear, but from knowing his people's way of life was ending. The terror of the Apache was never savagery. It was resistance refined into a weapon. Long before European empires learned how to rule through alliances, intelligence, and indirect control, the forests of northeastern North America were already dominated by a political and military force far ahead of its time. To their enemies, they were not just feared, they were systematically devastating. They were the Haudenosaunee, known to outsiders as the Iroquois Confederacy, and their method of warfare did not merely defeat rivals, remove them from history. Unlike the Plains tribes, whose power was visible in raids and cavalry charges, Iroquois terror was quieter, colder, and more calculated. They did not seek chaos, they sought control. The Confederacy originally united 5 nations: the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneglata, joined by the Tuscarora. This union was not symbolic, it was operational. Decisions were debated, war plans coordinated, and responsibilities divided. Where other tribes fought as independent groups, the Iroquois fought as a single strategic organism. This unity alone made them nearly unstoppable. Their homeland, dense forests and river networks, became a natural fortress. War parties moved silently through woodland corridors, traveling enormous distances without detection. Entire villages could be surrounded before a single alarm was raised. Attacks came at night or dawn, when confusion amplified fear. Fires were set deliberately, not randomly, to block escape routes and drive defenders toward ambush points. But what truly terrified neighboring tribes was what happened after defeat. The Iroquois did not simply kill their enemies, they absorbed or erased them. Captured survivors were often adopted into Iroquois families to replace those lost to disease or war. Their old names, languages, and identities vanished within a generation. Tribes that resisted too fiercely faced a darker fate. Systematic destruction, villages burned, food stores annihilated, crops destroyed to ensure starvation. This was not Raj, it was policy. European colonists later called this period the Beaver Wars. But to native nations caught in its path, It was something closer to an extinction campaign. Entire tribes disappeared from records, not because they migrated, but because they ceased to exist as distinct peoples. Iroquois psychological warfare was deliberate and ritualized. War paint, ceremonial chants, and symbolic acts were designed to terrify survivors and spread reputation faster than messengers could. Stories of Iroquois war parties traveled far beyond their borders, often causing villagers to flee at rumors alone. Fear became a weapon that softened targets before warriors even arrived. When Europeans entered the equation, the Iroquois adapted instantly. They mastered diplomacy with the same precision as warfare. French, British, and Dutch powers were manipulated, played against one another, and used as supply lines for firearms and trade goods. While other tribes were overwhelmed by colonial politics, the Iroquois weaponized them. At times, they acted as kingmakers, deciding which European power-controlled regions through alliance or hostility. Colonial officials both feared and respected them. Treaties with the Iroquois were treated as binding agreements between equal something, rarely extended to other native nations. Some colonial leaders privately admitted that angering the Confederacy was more dangerous than angering a rival European state. Yet the same system that created Iroquois dominance also demanded constant expansion. To survive, they had to replace population losses caused by disease introduced from Europe. Adoption and conquest intensified. Warfare became necessary not just for power, but for continuity. Over time, this relentless pressure drew them into deeper conflicts with colonial powers that no alliance could permanently balance. As European populations exploded and borders hardened, the Iroquois found themselves trapped between empires that no longer needed intermediaries. Their fall was gradual, not sudden. Authority fractured, influence shrank, land was lost treaty by treaty, but their legacy endured. The very structure that once terrified North America, their confederation, councils, checks on power later, influenced colonial thinkers. Elements of Iroquois governance found echoes in early American political systems, a bitter irony for a people whose strength once made settlers tremble. The Iroquois were feared not because they were savage, but because they understood something their enemies did not. War is not about winning battles, it is about deciding who remains. If fear on the frontier had a final, unforgettable shape, it came from two very different worlds, one born on the endless grass seas of North America, the other rising from stone temples and ritual fire far to the south. The Sioux nations of the Great Plains and the Aztec Empire of Mesoamerica terrified their enemies in profoundly different ways, yet both proved a truth history struggles to admit. When war is fused with belief, resistance becomes unbreakable. Asterisk 4. The Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota Sioux, war was not conquest for its own sake, was defense sanctified by spirituality. The plains were not property, they were sacred. Rivers, buffalo herds, sky, and soil were bound together by belief. To take the land was to violate the universe itself. This conviction transformed Sioux warriors into something us military commanders struggled to comprehend. Fighters who did not fear death, because death was not an end. As westward expansion accelerated in the 19th century. The Sioux faced invasion on a scale no treaty could contain. Forts appeared, railroads cut through hunting grounds. Buffalo Central to Sioux survival was slaughtered by the millions to break resistance. Yet instead of submission, this pressure forged unity. Bands that once operated independently came together in massive war coalitions, something rarely seen among Plains tribes. The results shocked the United States. At battles such as Little Bighorn, Sioux and Cheyenne warriors demonstrated coordination, discipline, and tactical intelligence that shattered myths of native inferiority. Cavalry units were surrounded, overwhelmed, and erased. Survivors spoke of waves of riders moving like a single body, of war cries shaking the ground itself. For the first time, the US Army realized it was not fighting scattered resistance. It was fighting a nation defending its soul. What made the Sioux terrifying was not cruelty, but resolve. They did not retreat because retreat meant cultural death. Even after military defeat, their spiritual resistance continued through ceremonies like the ghost dance, movements so powerful that authorities feared them as uprisings. Fear of belief itself culminated in tragedy, such as the massacre at Wounded Knee of Venborn, not of battle, but of terror at a people who would not spiritually surrender. Far to the south. Centuries earlier, another civilization had mastered terror as a deliberate tool of statecraft. The Aztec Empire did not hide its brutality, it displayed it. Unlike the Sioux, who fought to preserve a way of life, the Aztecs fought to sustain the cosmos. Their worldview held that the sun itself required nourishment through human blood. War was therefore sacred duty. Soldiers did not fight to kill, but to capture because prisoners were offerings to the gods. This ideology produced a form of warfare that unsettled even hardened Spanish conquistadors. Entire battles were ritualized. Warriors dressed in symbolic regalia, representing jaguars, eagles, and gods. Drums thundered. Conch shells screamed. The intent was not just victory, but intimidation so complete that enemies would break before. Resistance formed. Captured warriors were marched to towering temples, sacrificed publicly, their hearts offered to the heavens as crowds watched in reverent silence. This was not chaos. It was theater of power, designed to send a message across Mesoamerica. Resistance was not just defeat, was cosmic failure, and it worked. Many rival cities submitted without battle. Others fought desperately, knowing the alternative. The fear generated by Aztec ritual warfare expanded their empire faster than armies alone ever could. When the Spanish arrived, they misunderstood what they were witnessing. They saw savagery, not structure. Yet it was precisely this religious military fusion that allowed the Aztecs to dominate millions. Only betrayal, disease, and internal rebellion, not fearlessness, brought their empire down. In both the Sioux and the Aztec worlds, terror was never random. It was purposeful, rooted in belief systems older than any European empire. These societies terrified outsiders because they fought wars that could not be negotiated away. Land was sacred. Blood was sacred. Identity was non-negotiable. History often labels such peoples as frightening because it is easier than admitting the truth. They were terrifying because they could not be easily controlled. They remind us that the most powerful weapon humanity has ever wielded is not steel or gunpowder or numbers but conviction. And long after empires collapsed and borders shifted, that conviction still echoes in stories, ceremonies, and the quiet understanding that some fears are born not from cruelty, but from unbreakable will.